So first and foremost, I would like to welcome everyone. Hello and welcome to the World of Optometry webinar. So we are glad that you are joining us from wherever you are today. My name is Cherise Condenuevo and I will be hosting today's webinar. I am joined by my colleague Aya Almais, who will be assisting me in today's presentation. Before we get started, it is important that we cover some general housekeeping rules. So please have your cameras off and mics off. This is to eliminate any background noise which can cause feedback and noise disturbance to the speaker and other attendees. Please rename your electronic device with the name that you are registered with. This is the name that you will receive on your certificate of attendance. If your name on the device is not matching
लाइट सोर्स बैक साइड में जाना चाहिए हमेशा सामने होना चाहिए और प्रेफरेंस ये रहे कि अगर टेबल
certificate of attendance. I just would like to remind you to please turn off your camera and your mics off. And another thing, to receive your certificate of attendance, you will be required to stay for the duration of the webinar, after which we will send you a simple review form to fill out via email. Please post your questions into the chat box feature. You can do this at any time during the presentation, and they will be answered by the guest speaker. Please address your questions to everybody option. Aya, our second host, will be able to assist you with any technical difficulties during the presentation. So if you're experiencing any issues with sound or picture, let us know in the question chat box, all right? She may contact you to rename your electronic device during the presentation. If you have any queries about getting your certificates of attendance and the process, she will answer your queries. Today's presentation will last between 35 to 45 minutes, followed by a question and answer session. So I am delighted to present our speaker this evening, who is Mr. Simon Frackiewickz. He is an orthoptist and optometrist based in Somerset, UK. He has a great passion for education, and since 1999, he has provided practical training sessions for web and face-to-face lectures for binocular vision. Today, he will be delivering a webinar entitled, How Do You Solve a Problem Like a Heterophoria? Without any further ado, I will pass you over to our speaker for the commencement of this session. Thank you, Mr. Simon.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for giving your time up to come and hear me talk about eyes. I'm going to share my screen now, and I will show you what we're going to be talking about. So, good day. I've said good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. It's good to have your company today. I'm going to be talking today about heterophoria and how to detect and manage it, and the sort of things that you might encounter in optometric practice. I think it's probably useful to say, I'm speaking to you from the UK, and we have maybe different eye care facilities and different eye care structures in the UK from other parts of the world. So just to sort of explain how our professions interact with each other, optometry is a profession where it's primarily optometrists live in community high street practices. So I co-own a couple of practices in my local towns, and so people come to us of their own accord. They don't have to be referred to us by anyone else, and we undertake the testing of their sight, do the refraction, and we do eye health checks, so we do ophthalmoscopy. We also undertake a lot of minor eye injury problems as well. So if people have injuries or accidents involving their eyes, if they have infections, we can investigate and manage those in practice as well. Orthoptics is very different. Orthoptics is purely the study of squints and lazy eyes and double vision, and orthoptists aren't allowed to test sight. They're not allowed to refract people, provide spectacles to them, and they live in hospital settings. So we have the National Health Service here, which funds the vast majority of eye care, both in community practices and in the hospital setting. So much of the testing is free at the point of need. There are a small proportion of people who have to pay privately for their eye care, but even if they have problems with double vision, they would still be managed free of charge through the NHS in hospitals. So that gives you sort of a bit of a background about how the practices work and how the professions interact with each other. Typically, if somebody encounters somebody who has double vision, somebody who has binocular vision problems they can't manage confidently in practice, they would be referred by their general practitioner, so their family doctor, to the hospital setting where they see an orthoptist, who then, when they've finished, refers them back out into the community. So what we're going to talk about today then is heterophoria. So what is heterophoria? This is the Oxford English Dictionary definition of heterophoria. So it says a latent tendency to squint. I think what we in optometry think of heterophoria as being is it's a bit more detailed. So here it says a latent strabismus in which the visual axes are normally directed to the fixation object, but deviate when the eyes are dissociated. So that's effectively what we're doing when we do a cover test. You're stopping the eyes working together and seeing their resting position. And someone who has heterophoria, with both eyes together, their eyes will be aligned at the target they're looking at. But if you stop their eyes working together, then one eye will sort of move away and drift off. How many people have heterophoria? How common is it? Well, in the UK, certainly, I don't know of other parts of the world, but the study that I sort of saw most recently from the British Journal of Ophthalmology found that if you take a cohort of 4,000 children, you find that more than 55% of them have exophoria at near. So you can say most people have some sort of heterophoria. That reduces significantly. So in the distance, most people are actually orthophoric, so don't have a deviation at all. Esophoria and hypophorias are less common, but they can be quite problematic. Exophorias are common and most commonly controlled, but esophorias can be things that will catch you out. So why do people get heterophoria? What causes it to happen? You can broadly split these into two categories. You've got things like anatomical causes. So if there are anomalies with the muscles, so if one muscle is slightly too weak, but not enough to completely lose control. If there is any abnormal check ligaments, so the check ligaments are the things that within the orbit that hold the eye muscles in place. If they're positioned incorrectly, then that can make the eyes effectively out of position. So the heterophoria then is required to control the position of the eyes and stop them drifting into different directions. If someone has facial asymmetry, so someone with one eye much higher up than the other, or telecanthus, where they have extremely wide PD, then that will cause heterophoria because the eyes need that effort to work together. There can also be refractive causes. So you can have an underlying refractive error. So somebody who has an uncorrected hyperopia, for example, or people who have high or low ACA ratios. And we'll talk about ACA ratios later. It's also true, though, that you can get sort of bad dispensing can cause heterophoria. So if someone hasn't had their PD measured properly, or spectacles haven't been made at the correct sort of alignment for the optical centers, then in large plus or minus deviations, you can induce a heterophoria by causing there to be induced base out or base in prisms. So, you know, spectacles, if someone's very anisometropic, as I am, and my specs are like this, then I get vertical double vision because there's induced prism I can't control and can't bring my eyes back together. So it's really important that we consider these things when dispensing spectacles as well. How do we classify heterophoria? So this is, I don't know, this is overly complicated. It's fairly logical, really. If you're thinking of horizontal phorias, you've got those that go in too much and those that go out too much. So esophoria, the eyes across and naturally want to rest inwards. Exophoria, the eyes naturally want to rest outwards. And of those, you can have one that's bigger in the distance, bigger at near, or the same near in distance. And so that's what this table here says. So esophoria that's bigger in the distance means that you've got a divergence weakness, so you can't, your lateral rectus muscles aren't working effectively. If it's bigger at near, then your medial rectus muscles are working too much. And exophoria, the opposite is true. So if your exophoria is bigger in the distance, then you've got too effective, so your lateral rectus muscles are working too much. And convergence weakness, your medial recti aren't working enough. So it's kind of fairly logical. There are obviously vertical and cyclophorias. You can have in-cyclo and ex-cyclophoria. They're not classified in the same way, really. They're either there or they're not there. So if we think about why we get heterophoria, what we need for heterophoria to happen, you've got to have fusion. So you need to have two eyes. Your eyes need to be pointing in approximately the same sort of direction. And if you receive two disparate images, the brain receives one image from each eye, then that's what's required to kind of to allow heterophoria to happen. So fusion starts from about 2 or 3 months old. And as I've said already, you need to have images that are of similar size, similar shape, similar clarity. So someone with a unilateral cataract, someone who's got significant anisometropia, where one image is much bigger than the other, they'll have trouble fusing those images together. What causes fusion to happen is there's disparity in the retina and the presence of retinal disparity. So if we're thinking of retinal correspondence, where your foveas both correspond to each other and the temporal retina in one eye corresponds to the nasal retina in the other eye. If you have stimulus of the temporal retina in both eyes or the nasal retina in both eyes, that tells you that there's disparity there, and the eyes have to make a sort of a correcting movement to overcome that. So we have two components of fusion. You've got your sensory fusion, which is the ability for your eyes to actually lock together, and then the motor fusion, which is how you keep your eyes sort of locked together. So the sensory fusion develops first, and motor fusion then evolves to maintain sensory fusion and to stop double vision happening as soon as you move your eyes around. So motor fusion then, as I've said already, is designed to maintain sensory fusion. And you've got to have normal muscles and normal nerves. It goes without saying that if you have suddenly, you develop a sixth nerve weakness, you're going to lose your fusion, you're going to get double vision. So diplopia, double vision, is the consequence of losing your fusion. There are two ways that happens. You've got your version movements, which is what we generally test on ocular motility. So you've got your there's a lever version looking to the left, dextra version to the right. So where the eyes are moving in the same direction, that's called conjugate gaze. So conjugate being the eyes moving in the same direction. Vergences are your convergence and your divergence movements. So that's where the eyes are moving in opposite directions. But again, you're maintaining fusion in that sort of forwards and backwards, as well as sort of side to side movements. Convergence, that's again something that we should be testing routinely in optometric practice, and it's the largest component of the vergence system. The convergence itself has lots of different parts to it. So you have what's called fusional convergence, and that's what we've been talking about so far. That's where you get retinal disparity. So there's this, the temporal retina in each eye is stimulated, or the nasal retina in each eye is stimulated, and your eyes have to make an sort of overcoming movement. That's the biggest component of convergence. There's also accommodative convergence. So this is accommodation that is derived by you accommodating. So as you focus on something, you're aware of the accommodative triad. So if you accommodate on an object, your eyes converge, you get pupil meiosis, and you get accommodation of the lens in the eye. So when you accommodate your eye, you converge. When you converge, you accommodate. Those two things are linked together. You also have something called proximal convergence. So this is a bit more obscure, and this is where you know that an object is close to you and you then automatically converge. So an example of that is kind of quite popular at the moment are the VR headsets that you get. You put your mobile phone in a little sort of headset that you put in front of your eyes. Now there's an optical device in there that is telling your eyes that this object is at infinity, but you know it's not because you've got this thing in front of your eyes. So you're naturally going to converge a little bit when you look at a VR screen, no matter what the lens power is inside it. Finally, you have what's called tonic convergence. So tonic convergence is where you have natural tone in your eye muscles. Your eye muscles are sort of switched on, they're kind of active. And that takes a while to break down. So this is one reason, and we'll talk about this later, that you need to take time when you do your investigations for heterophoria. Otherwise, you may not see them. If you're too quick, you simply won't see them. Now, I spoke earlier about the ACA ratio, and this is something which is connecting accommodation and convergence. Now, I suppose this is what I would call in England as a hardcore orthoptic subject. It's something that you do a lot of in orthoptics. Optometry, I don't know how it's taught in your respective countries, but we may consider it less. But it's so vitally important, because as soon as you manipulate somebody's accommodation, you have to think about the effect that has on their vergence system, because you can very easily induce problems if you're not careful. What this connects then is looking at how much convergence you get for each unit of accommodation. So a normal range of an ACA ratio is between 2 and 4 to 1. So what that means is for each diopter of accommodation, you would expect to get between 2 and 4 prism diopters of convergence. However, in some conditions, and such as one example of this is a convergence excess esotropia, you can have well in excess of 10, sometimes 20. So that means that for each unit of accommodation, you get 10 or more units of accommodative convergence. And we'll see in a minute why that's relevant. How do we measure this? Well, there are some very obscure techniques for measuring this, again, in hospital settings or research settings. The easiest one is called the gradient method. And I have to say, this is probably the only one that you're ever going to actually practically want to use in practice. Because what you do here is you take the measurement of your cover test in the accommodative state, subtract it from the non-accommodative measurement, and you divide it by the amount of accommodation that's being used. And I'll give some examples of this later, so I don't expect you to remember this. But these are the kind of measurements you might actually be taking in practice. Other techniques for measuring the ACA ratio require drawing graphs and things like that, which are just never really going to happen in practice. I also need to touch on relative fusional vergences. These are obscure, and it's quite an abstract thing to describe, but these are looking at separating the plane of accommodation from the plane of convergence. And it shows, or gives an indication of how well controlled somebody's heterophoria is. So if you can only accommodate and converge at exactly the same position, that was going to be quite weak, because as soon as you change your accommodation, you have to change your convergence and vice versa. And that just requires a lot of input from the accommodation and convergence systems. If we have, as we do have, you have positive relative convergence, which is where you converge more than you accommodate. So if you're accommodating at, say, 30 centimeters, you can converge your eyes nearer than that, and things stay single in the background. They might be out of focus, but they're kind of not double. Negative relative convergence is the opposite, which is where you accommodate more than you converge. So you converge in one particular place, but you can accommodate in front of that. And if, as I've said already, if you don't have good fusion vergences, then you can develop symptoms from your heterophoria quite readily. This is what you manipulate if you do orthoptic exercises. Again, we're going to talk about these later. Then this is something that will enable you to sort of keep your control acute, if you like, and sort of toned. Now, fusion ranges, we talked so far about convergence and divergence and such like. These are, but it's really hard to get data on what is a normal fusion range. It's not out there particularly. When we measure horizontal fusion ranges, then if you're going to do it properly, you need to be looking at not just when somebody breaks and gets double vision, you should be asking about when the object blurs, because this here is the clue about how well controlled they are. When someone blurs, they've lost their accommodation. When they break, they've lost their convergence. So if there's a big separation between those two numbers, that's their positive and negative relative fusion vergence. So that's what you're measuring there, the distance between the blur and the break. If someone blurs and breaks at the same time, then that would suggest that they're not particularly well controlled. The recovery is where they kind of come back together. So these measurements here are taken in prism diopters. So it's suggesting that for near, you would, for your convergence range, you would have 17 plus or minus 5 diopters before you blur, then breaking was at 21 plus or minus 6, and then recovery, you have to go a long way back to reconnect those, reconnect your eyes and get single vision back. As we know, for distance, it's less, and the base in measurements are also smaller than the base out measurements. For some reason, I've only just realized I haven't put the base in measurements here, so I do apologize for that one. But we all know that there's much more convergence than there is divergence. You can also see that the vertical deviations are much, much smaller. You can not tolerate more than 2 or 3 diopters at a push, both up and down. So a typical vertical fusion range is only about 4 diopters in total. And we've mentioned briefly the cyclo, the torsional ones, which are obscure, very hard to measure, and something in reality, if you've got one of those, you can't do much about it. How do you detect heterophoria then? What methods are we going to use to actually find heterophoria? So the first one, I think, is just taking a good case history. If you listen to your patient, give them the chance to tell you what's wrong with their eyes, you can very often diagnose the heterophoria just from what they're telling you. If they say that, you know, I have to really blink my eyes to keep things focused, or if I let my eyes relax, I get double vision, or I get eye strain down here, or frontal headaches after I've used a computer for a long time. These are all real alarm bells, sort of red flags for saying, you know, somebody's got a misalignment of their eyes here. Other ways to look at it would be obviously the cover test. That's the principal way of doing it. And if you remember one thing from today's presentation, let it be this, that you can use your cover test in different ways. So we use what's called an objective cover test. This is where we cover one eye and cover the other eye, and we as practitioners look at the patient's eyes to see whether they move up and down, in and out, or whatever. But you can also use it subjectively, and this is where you ask your patient, as I move my cover from side to side, can you see that object moving? Now, I've been an orthoptist for 20 years. I've done a lot of cover tests in my time. And I would really struggle to find a 1 diopter deviation. Now, a patient is going to be able to see a 1 diopter deviation really quite well, because they'll see things jumping up and down or left and right. So I think it's sometimes a bit arrogant of us as optometrists just to say, oh, I looked, I couldn't see anything. If you ask a patient, can you see movement of the target that I'm showing you? They will tell you, and that is a big clue that there's something lurking in the background that you hadn't spotted. So for symptomatic heterophoria, that's a kind of get out of jail free. You can have that one. There's other tests like the Maddox rod, whether that's the lorgnette, the kind of handheld thing that looks like a spoon, or the thing that you can put in a trial frame or in a phoropter head. And that's where you obviously have a light seen with one eye, and the rod creates a perpendicular line. So if the rod is orientated horizontally, it gives you a vertical line, and it's testing a horizontal deviation. And you're looking to see where the light and the line sort of, how they coincide. Are they in line with each other? And you can do that both horizontally and vertically. There's things like the Malec Unit as well. Now, is the Malec Unit a test of heterophoria? Not really, but we'll talk about that in a moment. So what I want to do here is just discuss a cover test, how to do a cover test, what the components of a cover test are. So we're going to do here a cover-uncover test. So whilst we're talking about heterophoria, you wouldn't naturally use a cover-uncover test to detect heterophoria. We would use that to detect heterotropia. So that would be esotropia, exotropia, for example. And what you do on a cover-uncover test is you're looking at the movement of the eye that is not covered up. So in this case, we've got an infant looking at an optic fixation target, and we're going to cover over the right eye, look for movement of the left, and cover the left eye, looking for movement of the right eye, and there is no such movement at all. So that would tell you that there's no heterotropia, that there's no manifest squint, no strabismus, no manifest strabismus. If we contrast that with an alternate cover test, so this is how we detect heterophoria. So what we do here is we cover over one eye, and this time we're not looking at the uncovered eye, we're looking at the eye that is covered over. So if we flip, you need to keep the cover there for long enough to dissociate the eyes, then you want to flip it across to the other side, and you could see that slight inward movement. So if I just let this run, I want you to watch the size of the deviation as the cover keeps going from side to side. And you should see that the deviation gradually gets bigger over time, and then the eyes come back together. So if we sort of unpack that, I might actually show you that video again. So we'll go back and look at it one more time. So when we dissociate the eyes, we're looking at that eye coming in. So this is an exophoria. It gets bigger over time. And as we take away the cover, we look at that movement there, which is recovery. So that is just the most important bit of a cover test. I teach a lot of students how to do cover tests. And it's so often the case that they'll find a deviation, they'll get really excited and say, oh, wow, there's an exo deviation here. and they'll take away the cover and just turn away and write down their findings without looking at that vital split second. As you take away the cover, you're watching what happens. What's going on there is that you're creating heterotropia. So when you take away the cover, those eyes are no longer lined up with each other. They had, that person in that instant had an exotropia. And that then gives diplopia, which is the stimulus for fusion to happen. So that split second when you've taken away the cover and you watch those eyes come back together, that is a measurement of the quality of that person's fusion. If they have good fusion, then their eyes quickly lock back together. If they have poor fusion and poor control of their deviation, then it might take a while for them to sort of blink their eyes, or they may actually stay double for quite a long time. So it's that last bit when you take away the cover, that is the most important thing to watch. If you do anything, just watch that. As I explained already earlier, all those components of convergence, one of them was that tonic convergence. What you're breaking down by keeping the eyes dissociated, you're breaking that element of convergence down. That's why the deviation gets bigger the longer you dissociate the eyes. So if you're very quick with your cover test, you'll miss things like that. I was taught by someone at university that you could do both a cover-uncover test and an alternate cover test at the same time, by basically covering one eye, looking at this one to see if it moved first, and then as you take it away, seeing if you had a movement of the other eye under the cover. There is no way on this earth that you're going to properly dissociate the eyes doing that. It's lazy, it's poor practice, so please don't do that. Do the two separately, and you won't miss things. How do we measure heterophoria? Loads and loads of different ways of doing it. So prism and cover tests would be, if you like, one of the gold standard ways to do it. So you have either a prism bar, or if you have trial cases, free prisms, even RISI rotating prisms. And you do that with the cover test, the alternate cover test, and you're looking to see when the eyes stop moving. That is the most dissociative test, and is going to be the way that you'll get the most deviation out, because you're breaking down that tonic convergence. We've talked already about Malec's rod being used to detect heterophoria. You can also use it to measure heterophoria. So when you get the line and the light to join together, that gives you a measurement of the deviation. Because it is less dissociative, you may not get as much of a measurement there. So you need to be aware of the limitations of that particular type of test. There's also the Maddox wing. I have to say, this is my least favorite instrument in orthoptics. It's just, I think, a bit of rubbish. That's my personal opinion. It's prone to so many variations in accommodation. For me, I can have anywhere between 0 and 10 diopters of exophoria, just depending on how I accommodate my eyes on this Maddox wing. So I would have to urge people to proceed with caution if you're using that. Could you estimate it? That's what a lot of people do. I have to say I'm not an advocate for doing that at all, because it's kind of lazy, and unless you've done a lot of cover tests and you measured a lot of cover tests, you don't really know what your 4 or 6 diopter deviation is. And as a consequence of that, if you test somebody and you say, well, I think they're probably 2 diopters, and someone else tests the same person and they say, oh, they're probably 6 diopters, has that deviation increased? Has it not increased? We just don't know, really. So I think there's no excuse for not measuring deviations, really. Now, again, I've put here Malec Unit. So I hope we're familiar with the Malec Unit. This is a test of measuring associated phoria. Now, the tests that we've just talked about so far are measuring dissociated phoria. You're stopping the eyes working together, and you're measuring the deviation when the eyes are not completely working together. With the Malec Unit, you're measuring the associated phoria. So that's when the eyes are in natural space, but you're seeing, is there any underlying very slight misalignment of the eyes, not enough to cause diplopia, but enough to cause stress in the visual system. So it's not really a measurement of heterophoria, and you can't just use that to measure heterophoria, just as you couldn't just use any of the other objective methods to measure associated phoria. The two complement each other. So as we said already, it's a slight misalignment of the visual axes within Panem space. So if the deviation is, or the misalignment is within Panem space, then it doesn't cause double vision, but it just causes asthenopia, causes stress, and is often there in people who have symptomatic heterophoria. Again, being super duper geeky about it, Malec Unit that we see in optometric practice doesn't actually measure fixation disparity. It measures what's called the aligning prism. Fixation disparity is where you move the object, not the image. So unless you're working in a research environment, you're very unlikely to ever actually properly measure fixation disparity, because that's where the patient moves the object rather than we move the image on the retina. That's a lot of geekery, isn't it? Now let's talk about compensation. I'm not talking about this sort of compensation here that I don't know about in your respective countries. They're always advertised on the television. We're talking about how well controlled somebody's eyes are. So we often talk about a decompensating heterophoria. That's where the eyes aren't able to control the deviation and someone gains symptoms as a result. So how do you look at compensation and how well controlled they are? So one of them is the Malec Unit. So if somebody has misalignment of those markers on the Malec Unit, they don't have good control because there's some sort of tiny stress within the muscles. You can also look at the speed of recovery. As I've said already, if someone has a rapid recovery after a cover test, then they've got good control. If it's really slow, they've got poor control. So these are things that might guide you as to how to manage this patient and manage the symptoms that they're coming with. You can also measure fusional reserves. If you have fusion prism bars or rotating prisms, you can see how well someone can converge and diverge their eyes. That will give you a clue as to how well controlled they are too. But if someone does start to decompensate, then it will lead to eye strain, asthenopia, headaches, and sometimes even double vision. You sometimes see people, particularly children, who have a decompensating deviation that will sort of walk around like this, or they'll tell you that when I read, I find I need to close one eye, and I don't know why I do it. So these are all signs, clues that they've got a decompensating deviation. Why would something decompensate? Well, again, some of the reasons that we have heterophoria in the first place can also be reasons that we decompensate. So if someone has an uncorrected refractive error, someone who has a high plus, they're having to accommodate their eyes a lot, they will have to over converge their eyes, and it can make it difficult for them to control it. If the spectacles aren't fitting well, as we said already, if the specs are out of alignment, the PDs aren't properly there, then you can put that stress, you can induce that stress. What we've got to relate here is the size of the amount the person is converging with the fusion ranges that you'd expect that person to have. So in vertical deviations, if someone has poorly fitting spectacles that induce 1 diopter vertical deviation, if they've only got 3 or 4 diopters of fusion, that's an awful lot that you're having to overcome. Could I just ask the newcomers to mute your microphones, please? So thank you for joining us. If you could just mute your microphones, we'd be very grateful. Thank you. So anisoconia, that's where you have different image sizes from a different prescription between the eyes. So this is commonly the case when someone's just had cataract surgery in one eye and they're in that space between where they're waiting for the other one to be done, and they've suddenly gone from being +3 in both eyes to plano +3. There's a big image size difference, which makes it difficult for people to fuse and can again cause decompensation. Medical reasons: if someone's ill, tired, if they've had a head injury, if someone's certain medications, things like tricyclic antidepressants or sort of first generation antihistamines and things like that, that can affect the neurotransmitters within the accommodation system. There's also occupational reasons. So people, if they use a monocular microscope, then you're closing one of your eyes quite a lot of the time. That prevents the eyes from working together. If people are working very close up, if they're in jewelry making, or even staring just at a computer screen all day, these things can all lead to that decompensation. So how do we manage heterophoria? We've talked about how to find it, how to identify it. What can we do about it? So first and foremost, give someone the optimum refractive correction, making sure it's been dispensed properly as well. We can, if that's all been eliminated, look at correcting with prisms, and we'll talk about that later. There's also non-optical ways, such as orthoptic exercises, and maybe even if it's drastic, surgery. If someone has a very large decompensating deviation, that there's no way prisms are going to help. If they're 40 diopters or so, they may actually have to have surgery. So that is an option if necessary. Equally, there's botulinum toxin. I don't know if this is an option in your respective countries, but in the UK, it's possible to have Botox given to a muscle that's that's overacting to make it underact and keep the eyes in closer alignment. So that's quite obscure, but that is an option if needs be. Anyway, I think it would be time now to sort of pull this together and have a look at some examples of heterophoria in action, things you might actually encounter in practice. So the first case here, these are all based on actual people that I've seen in practice. So I'm not making these up, these are people that have come through my door. So the first one is a 25-year-old male, started a new job in computing. And after using a computer, he complains of developing frontal headaches and eye strain. Otherwise, he's in good health. He's never had an eye test before, so he doesn't wear spectacles or anything like that. So we'll have a little look and see what's going on. So the first thing we're going to do is our cover test. And we're doing here a cover-uncover test. Remember, we're looking at what's happening with the uncovered eye. So there's no movement of the uncovered eye. Now we do the alternate cover test. You might be able to see just a small movement there. Now, it's probably fairly obvious to you that I made these videos myself. They're a bit rubbish, I know that. But I wanted to get across the fact that you can get a very, very small vertical imbalance. That's the smallest one I could actually make, and they're often smaller than that. But what you noticed is that when we took away the cover, there was this kind of blinking thing going on. That is a massive clue that that person does not have good control of that deviation. So you saw a very, very small vertical deviation. Now, in reality, I don't think it would be that obvious at all. So this is where a subjective cover test comes into play. So if we do that test again, exactly the same test, and say to the patient, tell me what you see, and they say, oh, the chance is jumping up and down. So that's what that patient would notice when you did that test. If we think about what one diopter relates to, I've said already that in a vertical deviation, one diopter can be massive. It can be a quarter of someone's vertical fusion range. But what you see as a diopter is tiny. One diopter equates to 1 centimetre shift of an image over 1 metre. If you're testing at 6 metres, it means that that image the patient sees is shifting 6 centimetres. Now, 6 centimetres, that's big. They're going to see that. So they'll see a 6 centimetre up and down movement, but you may not see that yourself. So ask your patient, do you see things going up and down? What we can then do is, this is the Malec unit. So I would proceed to putting on these filters. So this is someone who's got no refractive correction. And what we're doing here is we're slightly dissociating the eyes by only showing 2 of the lines to each eye. So this eye sees those 2 lines, this eye sees those 2 lines. So I hope you're familiar with the Malec unit in practice. There's lots of different derivatives of it, but they're effectively doing the same thing. You're showing one eye. The only difference is that one marker horizontally and vertically in each eye. Everything else is seen by both eyes. And then what the patient often says, well, one of the lines is moving around or it's flickering. So in this case, the image seen with the right eye has gone downwards. So as a rule, when you're using the Malec unit, you always put the base where the line has gone. So if the line has gone down in the right eye, you put the base down in the right eye. So that's kind of a mnemonic, a handy mnemonic to remember what to do. So you put a base down prism, that sends the line up too high, and gradually over time it comes back to the middle. So in this particular case, this would be an aligning prism of 1 diopter base down in the right eye. So the other results, he's got good vision, he's got no refractive correction, he had this 1 to 2 diopter right hypophoria with delayed recovery. So when we talk about vertical deviations, you always talk about, if it's aphoria, it's always a hyperphoria. So it's always the higher eye that you refer to. If it's atropia, one eye could be higher or lower, but in aphoria, you're always talking about one eye in relation to the other. So one eye, you can't have a left hypophoria, it would always be right hyperphoria. So he's got a decompensating right hypophoria, and it's probably a long-standing muscle imbalance. There was no, on motility, there was no sort of big incompetence. And it's, in his case, he's decompensating because of a change in his visual demands. So he's now working on a computer, doing more stressful things with his eyes. So the prescription I gave to him was literally that. It was Plano with 1 diopter base down for him to use on an as required basis. It might be something he wants to use for prolonged television watching or driving a long way, but it's not something he would need all the time necessarily. This is another reason why you want to measure deviations. It's possible you can have a very slow growing tumor pressing on one of the components of the oculomotor system, which is causing a very slow increase in deviation. If you just estimate your deviations, you can miss that. And so an increase in deviation is something that must be referred. You can have an example where somebody has, let's say, 4 diopters of right hypophoria. And the first time that you see them, they need 1 diopter prism to help them control. And then the next year you see them, they need 2 diopters. And the next year they need 3 diopters. If that deviation is still exactly the same, that's not a problem. If it's still 4 diopters in the background, then that person is just gradually decompensating as they get older. But if the deviation were going from 4 to 5 to 6, and that's why the prism needs to get bigger for you to control it, that tells you that that's not a stable deviation. There's something causing that to change, and that needs to be referred just to eliminate some sort of unpleasant cause. So please measure deviations. Let's talk about another case then. So this is a 31-year-old female. She's had intermittent double vision most of her life. She's able to kind of zone out and forget the second image, but it is there. But it's always worse if she's tired or if she's wearing her spectacle correction. And she's short-sighted, myopic, so she needs to have spectacles to aid her far vision. She's had no previous ocular history. She's had no orthoptic intervention. She's had no surgery on her muscles or anything like that. And she's fit and well. So we have a look at her cover test. So what we're doing here is looking at cover test near with no spectacle correction. And just for ease of speed, I've done the cover-uncover test already. There's no manifest deviation, no tropia. So if we watch here, what happens on the alternate cover test, you can see that her eyes moved out to take up fixation. So we'll go through that again and just watch one more time. So we're looking at something at near. You can see the corneal reflections are aligned, but she's got this outward movement to take up fixation. When we take away the cover, her eyes quickly recover back to the straight ahead position. So that's an esophoria with good recovery. If we put on her spectacles now, so she's myopic, and see what happens there. So her corneal reflections are no longer aligned. You should be able to see there that she's got a left esotropia, so quite a significant left esotropia. And if we do our alternate cover test, sorry, our cover-uncover test rather, so she will alternate between the two, but she can't control that. So that is now heterotropia, not heterophoria. We've broken her down. If we then show her a light, then her eyes become straight again. And there's no esodeviation at all. So by showing her a light, could I ask our newcomers to mute your microphones, please? Thank you for joining us. If you could mute your microphones, we'd be grateful. Thank you. By showing her a light, you're taking away any accommodative demand. So this is a big clue here. There's something amiss with her accommodation convergence system. When she's got her spectacles off, she can control her esophoria. When she's got her myopic spectacles on, that's causing her to accommodate more, and the extra accommodation is causing her eyes to converge too much. If you take away that accommodation, even with her spectacles on, she's able to maintain control. So there's a big clue there that there's something not quite right with her accommodation system. So if we look at the other results here, without her spectacles on, she's got poor vision in the distance, but good vision at near, which you'd expect in someone who's short-sighted. Her refractive correction, she's -2, -1.5, so about -1.75 on average between the eyes. Her acuity improves nicely with the spectacles on, and she's able to see well with the spectacles on too. But from the cover test results here, we saw that she has atropia, a manifest deviation, when she has her specs on at near. And also for distance, there's also a smaller deviation, but it's actually atropia. Now, it says here on the Malec unit, I found her to have 3 diopters of base out slip in either eye for distance. So she's got 14 diopters of esotropia, but with a total of 6 diopters of prism, she's able to control that well and maintain sort of single vision. And that was also able to maintain single vision for near. So what's going on here? Well, we can't talk about heterophoria without talking about heterotropia, because at the end of the day, heterotropia, you'd have that if you didn't have your phoria. If you didn't have your fusion, you'd be left with the heterotropia. So the heterophoria is stopping you getting heterotropia. With accommodative esotropia, which is what she has, there are two different types. You've got fully accommodative, which is where you get esotropia on accommodation, but it's caused by uncorrected hyperopia. So someone who is plus but not corrected, and they have a normal ACA ratio. So in this situation, the uncorrected hyperopia makes them over accommodate, and the excessive accommodation gives you excessive accommodative convergence. The alternative to that is convergence excess, which is where you have esotropia on accommodation, as she does, but there's often no hyperopia, which applies in her case, and it's because there's a high ACA ratio. So there's a normal amount of accommodation, but too much accommodative convergence is coming out of the system. And I think you'd agree that that's what we've got here. So if you remember from earlier, we talked about how to calculate the ACA ratio, and I said that you took your accommodative cover test measurement minus the non-accommodative cover test measurement divided by the amount of accommodation. In her case, there are her measurements there. So for near, when she's accommodating, she's 25 diopters. For near without accommodation, she's 4 diopters. And with her refractive correction, it's about minus 1.75. So you can plumb that into that calculation. That's and that gives you a number of 12 to 1. So that means that her ACA ratio is high. She's got normal accommodation, but abnormal accommodative convergence. They in reality are very difficult to treat. So how do we manage a convergence excess esotropia? We need to try and correct her myopia and join her diplopia and control her accommodation. So what I elected to give her was this here. So giving her the full minus prescription, but so as to control her accommodation for near, we had to stop her from accommodating. So we put her in a progressive lens, so in a varifocal. And that worked brilliantly well for her. So she's maintained that clarity and single vision for near and distance. We're going to cover one more case now, and this is a 20-year-old female who was an English literature undergraduate, so at university studying English literature. And she was developing eye strain for reading, which is understandable if you're in a degree where you're doing a lot of reading, as hers would be. She occasionally reports horizontal double vision, and she used to, as a child, have issues at school of the same, for which she was given some exercises. So if we have a little look here, so we're going to do our cover test again. So we're looking at a near object, and we're including the right eye. And on the cover uncover test, we're looking here at the uncovered eye. So there's no movement of the uncovered eye. We go on and do the alternate cover test. You can see that there's this inward movement each time. So it tells you that she has an exophoria. And the control was, okay, not brilliant, but it was just, it took a little while for that eye to come back. What we can do now is test her near point of convergence. And you can see that at this point here, right, we'll go through that again. So we'll test a near point of convergence. So what you can ask is, as things get closer to her, we're looking at the budgie. I don't know if you have these sticks in your respective countries. This is a Snellen stick. On the back side of that is a picture of a budgerigar. And you can ask her, right, I want you to tell me when this becomes double, but you can also ask about blur. So as it gets nearer to her, the image will blur, then she gets double vision. And then as you come back out again, she can eventually recover. So that's your blur, your break, your recovery. You don't have to use prisms for that. You can do that just within free space. It's not as accurate, but it just gives you a clue as to that difference between when the image blurs and the image breaks. So what are her other results then? So she's got good vision, both near and distance. She has a low amount of hyperopia, so she's plus 0.75. And for near, she's a 6 diopter exophoria with fair recovery. And in the distance, she had no movement at all. Her near point of convergence was 15 centimeters, left eye diverging with diplopia. And when we used the Malec unit at near, there was 1 diopter basin of slip in either eye. So it was a total of 2 diopters of slip. But this is one of these where we need to proceed with caution, because there's different things that we could do in this situation. And if in her case, she's plus 0.75, if we give her a correction for her hyperopia, what that does is it relaxes accommodation, which reduces accommodative convergence, which will then increase her divergent deviation. So you can make an exo deviation bigger by giving her a plus correction. So in this situation, had we not done a cover test, had we only done those top 2 lines of information and just done vision and refraction, you'd say, well, you've got eye strain, you're doing a lot of reading, you obviously an undercorrected plus, have some plus 0.75s, that will help you. In her case, it may actually make her worse, because you counterintuitively, you can increase that size of the deviation and make the control even worse. So this is where doing a cover test is really, really important. So what can we do? So she's a decompensating exophoria of the convergence weakness type. So for distance, she's fine. For near, she can't converge enough. So that's the convergence weakness type. What are our options? So we could give spectacles with the prism, but perhaps not give her the hyperopia, as we've said. One thing I didn't put on that list of test results is her accommodation. So if her uniocular accommodation was normal, there's no need to give her that plus. If it's reduced, you might want to give the plus as well. We could give her orthoptic exercises. This is one of those scenarios where that can happen. So first things first, you would do a push-up convergence. So you would sort of, maybe with a pen, get her to look at the tip of the pen and bring it closer to her. The thing to be really, really careful about when you're doing orthoptic exercises, though, is that the person is actually binocular, that you're not trying to exercise somebody that doesn't have the ability to fuse. And the way to do that is to show that they have a physiological diplopia. So had we had longer on this talk, I would show you the slides on physiological diplopia. But in essence, if you ask them to hold their fingers up one in front of the other, look at this finger here, they should be able to see in the background, the other finger is double, and vice versa. If they're looking at the back finger, the front finger should be double. If they can see that, the fusion system is kind of okay to go on with the exercises. So you first of all would start with a push-up test. So you're looking to see when things go double, and you push it back to make it single, come forward to make it double again, gradually getting closer and closer and closer, taking time to relax the eyes. It's very easy to cause the eyes to go into spasm if you don't relax them. So you should maybe do no more than 5 minutes at each time. You should maybe do relaxing the eyes for at least 5 minutes after they've done the exercises for 5 minutes. You can then do things like a dot card, and then move on to stereograms. Stereograms are a type of orthoptic exercise where we're manipulating the relative fusion divergences. So this is an idea of an example of a stereogram. So again, I don't know if you've seen these in your respective countries, but these are called cat stereograms. And the idea is that the patient would put their finger in the center of the cats. So it's a small card, probably about the size of a postcard. And what you would see is effectively you're trying to get one eye to see each cat. So you put your finger in the middle of the card. As you pull your finger closer to you, you're looking at your finger. You can even try this on your screen, it works quite well. You get a third cat appear in the middle, which has 2 sets of whiskers, ears, and a tail. And the idea is that person is supposed to maintain that, first of all, and then try and get that to become clear. So you're separating the plane of convergence from the plane of accommodation to improve that control. So this is an example of what they'd see. If they're looking at their pen or a finger, as they come closer to them, they get this third image in the middle, which that's what they're trying to hold on to. And in time, that will gradually become clearer and clearer and clearer as their negative relative accommodation or positive relative convergence increases. So this is probably what you've been waiting for, the end. Thank you for your attention. I hope this has proved of interest. I want people to take away the fact that heterophoria is around us. More people have it than don't have it, and you need to do your cover test accurately to try and find it. I appreciate your attention. If you've got any questions, I'll happily take them now. If you need to get in touch with me, that's my Twitter handle, not that I use it very often, or you can email me at that email address there. But yeah, thank you for your attention. And yeah, I'll happily take any questions.
Thank you very much for a very exciting and very insightful presentation, Simon. You have covered a very good topic and have given us some wonderful insights that we can take away today. I especially love the videos. But unfortunately, I will now pass you over to Aya Almais, who will commence our question and answer session.
Thank you. We have some questions which have been submitted by our attendees, which I will read for you now. Majida asks, can patching for amblyopia treatment for anisometropia leads to heterophoria?
It wouldn't cause heterophoria in itself, but it would potentially cause decompensation. So if somebody had heterophoria already and you patch them, on the one hand, you're improving the sight in the amblyopic eye, but you're also disrupting their fusion. So it can be a really difficult balance to get right. If you remember when we said, what are the things you need for fusion to happen? You need to have images that are equally clear, the same size, and for them to be kind of equal clarity, brightness, and etc. And if you don't have that, so if you've got one amblyopic eye, you can't fuse very well. So you improve the amblyopia to improve the vision, but by doing that, you disrupt the fusion. So it's almost like a bit of a chicken and egg situation. In reality, you want to have the best vision you can to help with the fusion, and you wouldn't be patching all day, every day. So it would only be transient decompensation that you might cause. I would, if you're patching in practice, be really careful with people that don't have binocular single vision. Always prove that they've got the ability to fuse before you start to patch, because in older children, you can really, really mess things up. So please be careful. And in little babies, don't patch babies unless you know what you're doing.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, what is the ideal age for surgery in case of simulated intermittent distance exotropia?
I don't know that there is one, to be honest. The philosophies of surgery in the UK, you speak to 4 people, you'll get 10 opinions. There's no rhyme or reason to it, to be honest. I think from a surgical perspective, you want to wait till they're older, because the eyes would then be more of an adult size, and the surgery is probably going to be more long term. If someone is symptomatic and decompensating, and in a young child losing binocular single vision, so if they're within the critical period, if they're 4 or 5 and they're losing control, you want to get on and do that as soon as possible. So it has to depend on those individual circumstances. There's no one size fits all, I'm afraid.
Okay, another question, what to consider about heterophorias when we do refractive surgery?
Good question. Yeah, so I suppose it's like any sort of refractive correction, which is what you're doing with refractive surgery. You've got to consider the implications of that. If you were to take away, let's imagine, right, you put me on the spot here. So someone who had an esophoria, who were exo, like the example that I gave you earlier of the lady, the second case, if she had refractive surgery, that would probably solve her problems, because it's taken away the myopia, which is the extra accommodation cause. And that you get sort of 2 for the price of 1 then. Whereas in others, if you're inducing a myopic correction, so if you're taking away, you'd have to consider it in the same sort of way that you would anybody else. So that's a bit of a vague answer, but yeah, it would be the same as any other sort of vision correction. If you're making a change, manage expectations. If someone is hoping to be completely liberated from spectacles, they may need spectacles with prisms over the top to control the induced heterophoria that you've created from the refractive surgery. So manage their expectations.
Thank you very much for answering those questions. Unfortunately, in the interest of time, we may not have answered all the questions. If you do have any further questions you would like to be answered, you can email them directly on the email that's on the screen now. I will now hand on back to Cherise.
Thank you, Aya. For everyone, thank you for your attendance today. Your thoughts are very important to us. We will be sending you an email for you to fill in and submit a short feedback survey to complete the requirements for your certificate. This will also guide us in future presentation topics. So please, everyone, like and subscribe to our Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube channel for updates and insights about the world of optometry. I will now bring today's presentation to a close and wish you all a very good day.